right, everyone. Welcome to the next edition of our Some Engineering podcast. Today we have Patrick DeVivo, who is the founder and CEO of a company called MergeStat. And Patrick and I today are going to talk about operational analytics. Patrick, welcome. Tell us a little bit about what does MergeStat do?
Sure. Great. Thank you for having me, Lars. It means a lot to be here, and I really appreciate it. So MergeStat's mission right now is to enable open source operational analytics for software engineering organizations. What that means for us right now is basically anything that's involved in building or shipping software, we would like to make queryable with SQL. We're focused primarily on source code and the history of source code at the moment. That's kind of our starting set of data sources. We've actually found that there's a surprising amount of value that can come from just moving the contents and history and kind of metadata around Git repos into a SQL database for ad hoc querying. And that's kind of the main area that we're exploring right now. We have a number of things that we want to keep exploring when it comes to servicing this mission of operational analytics for engineering organizations. But that's where we're started, and we have some use cases there that I'm happy to talk about.
Can we double click a little bit on the term operational analytics? And you mentioned a few things like GitHub repos. Like what defines operational analytics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if I'm the best person to answer it. I think for us, a big part of what it means is analytics or using data to be able to take action on something in your engineering organization. So to be more effective in an engineering team in some way, right? And so we found this playing out in a number of different ways, with a number of different personas, from ICs all the way up to engineering leaders and VPs, being able to use data to take action in some way. And for us, taking action in the context of an engineering organization.
So this theme of bringing visibility into engineering operations and using data for that is something I've seen emerge in the past, I want to say, year. And I think we've seen that in the modern data stack in the past 5 years. Like, oh, I have a bunch of SaaS systems. There's knowledge in there, and I want that knowledge, and I'm going to extract data, right? ELT, cloud warehouses, but engineering out of all organizations haven't really done that, right? So is that it's been a little bit of a black box. Is that something you've observed as well? Like how did you get the idea to build MergeStat?
Absolutely. Sure. So the idea actually emerged probably from something a little bit different from that, but I think the theme remains the same. So we're building MergeStat overall because in our experience, right, engineering organizations and teams have typically been that kind of black box that are often gut feel driven and intuition driven and aren't often data driven. And I think for good reason in a lot of ways, right? If you think of engineering as more or as software development as more art than science in some ways, that makes sense that there are ways in which it should be intuition based and gut feel based, but there are also ways that you can use data to be more effective as an IC or as a leader in an engineering organization. But MergeStat really began as an experiment, an open source project that was an experiment to bring together two technologies that I was interested in at the time. So SQL, in particular SQLite, and Git repos. So putting those together allowed me at the time to ask arbitrary questions or ask ad hoc questions about the source code and the Git repos that I was interested in and working in at the time. And the context for that was really around exploring legacy code to understand who were the personas relevant to the things that I was working on. So could I use SQL and the Git history of a code base to find experts in certain parts of the code, to find maybe areas that haven't been touched in a while and should be returned to, and just kind of ask questions of these old code bases, 6 years old, with a lot of engineers coming and going, to help deliver context to me as an engineer to understand the history of it and understand what's going on, to know who to go to for support, and just get a little bit more clarity in why things were done a certain way. So from there, I was just going
Sorry.
to say from there,
No, no.
the use cases kind of expanded, right? So that was looking typically more at Git history. We kind of expanded the tool into supporting queries across the contents of code bases as well. And then the next shift was being able to query across many repositories. So taking another step back. And that is where we started to find value in larger organizations and larger engineering teams that have lots of Git repositories, lots of source code out there, and wanted to ask questions about that in some aggregated way. And so since then, we've been exploring kind of more use cases that support that. And we found a theme that keeps popping up um, is this the value in being able to provide data to support kind of things that are often gut feeling and intuition based.
And okay, so the audience for this data, you started as an IC, right? As an
Yes.
IC, I'm curious about my own history, my
Yeah.
GitHub, yeah, my repo history, my own maybe efficiency, engineering efficiency, and um, and a lot of times that may just be curiosity, right? I want to
Mm-hmm.
explore. I want to be able to ask questions. And then you said, okay, now we're going to a broader organization, many different repos. I'm going from a single repo to many different repos.
Yeah.
How do you see um how do you see the audience for this data evolve? Because
Yeah.
typically when you present a new data set, and you and I are both founders, right? And investors will ask, well, what problem do you solve, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And they always look for the hard use case versus, I like to take the steps out. Well, let's just get the data out
Right.
and figure out to ask questions, and then we'll figure out what problems we can solve. Because a lot of times people are just not aware of the data that's out there. So
Sure.
how do you see the audience evolve for this? And what are some of the reactions you observe when you present them with this data?
Yeah. Absolutely. So I would say something that we've noticed is that when we engage with an early user, they're typically coming to us with a specific use case in mind. So they'll see what we can do, and they have a problem that they have that they want to use MergeStat to solve, and that can be something very narrow. So, for instance, we had someone come to us and they needed to do data collection for a SOC 2 audit. So they needed to look for a whole set of pull requests in certain key GitHub repositories to show that they were following proper change management protocols when it came to source code changes, things like that. We helped them with that use case, helped provide the data for that audit that they went through. But then when they realized that they had all this data now synced into MergeStat, they could begin exploring it and asking questions on it, and started using us as a general purpose tool for asking just anything that kind of came to mind. So we've helped them now with use cases around tracking the progress of CI system migrations. So this is a user that has close to 1,000 repos in their org. It's
Okay.
something that's hard to do manually, and click through a GitHub UI to track these things manually. So they were moving CI providers, and one of the things they needed to do was remove the old YAML config from the repo and add the new one. And so they didn't have very much visibility into what the status of that migration was throughout their org. So one of the queries we helped them with was just get them those numbers. How many repos have the old system installed? How many have the new? And that's a theme that we've been seeing in some of our use cases as well. So querying lots of repos in an org to see what tools are being used, what third-party tools for various reasons, whether it's a migration or just to understand the adoption of something, right? Maybe I'm a security persona at an org and I brought in a security tool and I'm encouraging the development teams to adopt it. But how do I get visibility into whether they're actually using it or not? So helping with those types of queries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when
So
we say
yeah,
queries, you mean SQL, right?
yes, correct. So our approach right now, and our approach generally has been based on SQL. Recently, we've shifted towards a Postgres approach, and our product is centered around that at the moment. So basically, we move data from tools and APIs that are involved in building and shipping software in some way into Postgres, so that you can then query it within our app, but then also through other tools, BI tools, visualization platforms that know how to speak to Postgres. And we found that that's been very valuable to us as a company, getting things off the ground, because it's given us an escape valve to early users to get value from our data quicker. But it's also been valuable to our users who may already be using a tool like Metabase or Grafana or Superset internally. They can now access data about their software development lifecycle using MergeStat.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to. You mentioned your whole data pipeline chain from the source all the way to some dashboard, and I do want to double click into that in a minute here.
Sure.
But specifically around SQL.
Yeah.
Now, what you could have done is build a product the old way of like, hey, I'm going to acquire data in some proprietary way that fits me. I have my own black box data model behind the scenes, right? And then I put a pretty dashboard on top of it. And that's how a lot of engineering tools have been built in the past. And they're still building them like that, right? And a lot of times I think they're focused on the, like right now, there's a problem right now in our infrastructure and our code. We need to fix it right now. It's very reactive, right? So how come you've chosen to not go the old way of building a product, but like the new way of saying, hey, we're going to collect data and we're going to put SQL on top of that data?
Yeah, that's a great question. We want to be seen more as data infrastructure for this domain, as opposed to a end-to-end SaaS solution for a particular use case, right? We don't want to necessarily become, experts in DORA metrics and give you all the canned DORA metrics dashboards. We are taking this approach because we believe that there's a lot of value in having access at this lower level to the data in terms of flexibility of what you can do with it. So being able to ask arbitrary questions of it using SQL in this kind of ad hoc way allows you to craft the queries to fit your organization, right? Every organization is different. And so the questions that, from a high level, the questions being asked might be similar, but when it comes to the specifics of, certain filters and aggregations, that can be vastly different, right? Maybe there are certain things that you want to filter out because you use a certain tool and you don't want to see that in your data or in the results of your queries. We've actually seen some value in being able to support users that have come from an existing engineering metrics product that kind of gives them the full dashboard experience, but the number that they cared about either wasn't there exactly how they wanted it to be, or they just wanted to tweak it a little bit. And so by using MergeStat, they were able to compose that query themselves to get to the thing that they cared about more specifically as an organization. And that's been really cool to see.
So okay, and that's because they already had SQL skills, right? Everyone knows how to write SQL, so it's this, yeah. And then giving them access to the raw data allows them to formulate their question, write a SQL query, and they can run that query because they have access to the raw data in a Postgres instance, right? Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's okay. Flexibility and simplicity, essentially. So then, it would be great actually if we can see the product. Before we do that, can we talk a little bit about this whole data supply chain, like how you acquire data? I imagine you call the APIs. Those APIs were not written for data. They were written for workflows probably, right? And so you need to acquire that data. How do you do that? How do you build your own data pipelines?
Yeah, so we've built them ourselves in code. So a MergeStat deployment uses MergeStat written code to collect data from Git repositories, GitHub API, and some other data sources. We found actually that there have definitely been some gotchas around that. So the GitHub API has not been fun to deal with in some ways, and we found that there's actually been value in just doing that integration work. So it's just kind of standard API data consumption, I guess. So respecting rate limits, paginating through data, that kind of thing. But we do build that as a part of the app right now. So one of the things that we are actually hoping to do and have roadmapped is move towards a configuration-based approach to how we collect data. Right now, if we want to support a new data source that requires a code change in MergeStat, we'd like to be able to support a configuration-based approach. So if you want to bring in your own data source, maybe another API like a PagerDuty or a Jira that we don't support now, or maybe you want to run the output of some CLI tool against a Git repository and upload the results into Postgres for downstream querying, we'd like you to be able to configure that how you might configure a CI pipeline. So through some sort of configuration language, possibly a YAML approach, we're still kind of working through it, where you can configure that pipeline, give it to MergeStat, and then we'll run it, sync the results into SQL so that you can then query it and make use of it alongside your other data and also through these other BI tools and platforms.
Great. So then why don't we show and tell? We've done the tell part. Let's do the show part. Can you maybe
Sure.
show us what MergeStat looks like and walk us a little bit through your dashboard? And then also you mentioned Grafana Metabase. Maybe you have some examples there too. I checked your GitHub repo. There's actually a few nice screenshots. So
nice. Great.
All right.
So this is what an instance of MergeStat looks like today. So this is an instance that we deploy for ourselves internally. We don't have that many repos, right? So close to 50, but we've still been able to find value in using our own tool, which has been really cool. What you're seeing here is the management panel for all of the repos that we have data syncing for. So I can see here the status of the syncs that are running at a high level, right? So what's queued to run, what's currently running, what's run successfully. I can click through to see more context around all of those data syncs. You can see most of them are Git related and GitHub API related. There's two at the bottom that are a bit different. These are third-party tools that we've added support for. And this is in service to that idea of being able to take an arbitrary tool, any tool that you might want to run against a code base and access the output of that in SQL. So we'd like to be able to support these types of things in a configuration-based approach. You can click through to see logs around what's happening behind the scenes during each of these data syncs as well. But as a consumer of this tool, right, this is more for an operator of it, you're probably going to want to be more in the query section. And so this is an area of the app that we're hoping to invest in pretty heavily over the next several weeks and months. It's pretty bare bones at the moment. It allows you to run just basic SQL queries against the Postgres database. So I have one example lined up here. This was actually a use case that we had internally where we wanted to access all the places in a Go code base that use environment variables. So we wanted to pull out all the environment variables that our app uses to get that list. We were developing a Helm chart for our deployment, and so we wanted to just see like where are we accessing env vars. It's pretty simple, right? So it's just a regular expression-based search, and it's not perfect. It won't be able to match for places where an environment variable is where it's not passed as a string, right? Where a variable is passed into this function call. But this was kind of good enough for our purposes and was a cool example for us.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the simplicity is pretty convincing.
Yeah. And we want to develop more examples, right? More of an ecosystem of example queries so that as a user of MergeStat, you're not faced with this blank, SQL editor box, but you can more easily get started with something that's canned, right? An example query like this, where you can edit and fill in kind of the things that are more relevant to whatever your use case is.
Yeah, I think it's that when you present people with data, they get very excited, but often they don't know, okay, what questions do I actually ask now? What can I ask, right? And so that's the data cold start problem, and you're making that easier by giving them canned queries, right?
Yeah, we'd like to. We've definitely experienced that with some of our early users where it's like, this is great, I love the idea, but what do I do next, right? Like show me how to get this thing off the ground. And so we've been doing a lot of hand holding, but we want to make that hand holding a part of our product.
What are some, maybe you can give 3 examples, like, okay, now we've got all your data, MergeStat is up and running, like here are 3 queries you should run right now. Do you have a few examples? Do they differ
That's
by industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess two that I can think of off my head. So again, it kind of depends on what you're interested in, right? So what your persona is in an org. One that we've found people like is for orgs that have lots of code bases out there, just being able to pull out the versions of programming languages used in all those repos. So if you're a Go shop and you're running lots of Go repos, writing a query that aggregates all the Go versions used in those repos, so like declared in a go.mod file. Let me see if I have an example for that for our code bases. This is that's a to-dos dashboard. Looks like I actually don't have it queued up. But that was an example that resonated. Similar approach with querying for React versions, so the versions of certain key libraries. That was something that we actually did internally. We have a number of front end code bases around, and we upgraded one to React, one to 18, and we kind of thought to ourselves, there's probably a bunch of others that we should upgrade as well. And so we ran a query that surfaced, here were the 5 other repos that were on older versions of React. So just being able to ask those types of questions about your code. The other I can show, I guess, that is somewhat generally interesting is to-do comments. So to-do comments are kind of a fact of life, regardless of how you feel about them. So this was a dashboard we put together. This is for our own data. We don't look at this too much, but we actually work with a user who is interested in tracking to-dos. They track it as a proxy for keeping tabs on technical debt items. So this surfaces all of the places in their code that they have to-do comments, and it does some aggregations on them. So we join this with Git blame data, show when was the last time it was touched, how old are these to-dos across multiple repos, and then break them out by author, by Git blame author, and by repo as well.
So just looking at this, okay, open PRs, yeah. So now we're in a place where you've gotten them data, you help them write their first queries, they're getting insights, they're getting visibility into what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the next step is, okay, now I'm going to take action based on that information.
Right.
And that requires human change, right? So what do you see happening once they have this data and all of a sudden, like, okay, I'm getting KPIs, I'm getting answers to my questions. What's the next thing they do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, it kind of depends on what the use case is. Sometimes the use case and the action is the data itself, right? So in that kind of data collection for audit example, the action there was to deliver that list of pull requests that didn't follow the best practices. Sometimes it's the operationalization, I don't know if that's a word, of the data through a tool. So through something like a Grafana to alert on something that you might want to know about. So for instance, we have an example PR dashboard here. For us internally, one thing that we are thinking more about lately is PRs merged without review. So keeping tabs on that and notifying when that happens. And then similarly, PRs that are open for a long period of time. So if they're stale, essentially. So being able to trigger an action there, just so that we can manage them and not let it get out of hand. So
very interesting. And so what do you look? I mean, there's an open source version, right?
Yes.
Of MergeStat. I can go to your GitHub repo, I download it, connect my data sources. How do I do that actually? How do I connect my data sources? Can you show that real quick maybe? I think that's interesting to see in your dashboard.
Sure. So this instance is already set up, but what the flow looks like to add repositories once you've authenticated to GitHub, something like this. And you don't need to add authentication if you're working with just public repos. We have kind of a matrix of the permissions you need on and off for public versus private repos and the scopes for your token, that kind of thing. But this is what the flow looks like. So you can automatically import all the repos from a GitHub organization or user. That's what we do for our MergeStat repos. You can add one-off repos by URL or add a list from CSV, which has been valuable for some folks that have a kind of a list of different repositories across many different orgs that they're interested in doing some analysis on. So that's the basic add repo flow. Once you have those set up, you can click in and kind of flip on and off the schedule of the different data syncs. So the next step in that add flow is to set the default syncs for all of those repos that get brought in. We don't have great functionality around bulk actions at the moment, but that's something that we're working on. And kind of our escape valve there is being able to do that in SQL. So because we're giving access to the SQL database here, there's some management functions that can be done in that way as well. That's something that will make its way into the app soon.
So to get up and running with MergeStat, technical installation, all of that aside, what do you recommend to an engineering leader? Like, what are the first steps, right? Like, why should you do this?
Yeah.
And what are the steps to get immediate value?
Yep. So typically we suggest that people try running it locally. We have a Docker Compose setup flow that allows you to bring up this instance on your laptop locally. And that's the easiest way to get started. It typically means that you don't have to deal with the deployment. We have a Helm chart as well. So if you have internal clusters, you can eventually get to a deployment on Kubernetes. But typically what we've seen is, or what we've been suggesting to people is just run it locally, add some repos that you're interested in querying about, and just play with the data there and see what it looks and feels like. And then if you're interested in kind of a bigger deployment, maybe because you want to import more repositories or have things running in the background and have better data liveness, then run a deployment on a Kubernetes cluster.
And once I have my data, I can work with your team and you personally to start maybe writing some canned queries. And maybe you can share your GitHub repo so people see it when we have this up on YouTube.
Yeah, definitely. So this is our docs page.
Yeah.
And then we get to our GitHub repo here.
There you go.
This is the MergeStat deployment that I was just showing. What I will also show is MergeStat Lite, which is our original open source project, which is our SQLite-based approach. And this is a command line tool for running SQL queries against local Git repositories. So similar in idea, but different approach, different SQL context and tool. And this is meant to be run locally, just on a laptop as a terminal interface.
And now, okay, so I've got it installed. I connected some repos. I'm the engineering leader. Now I got all this data. And now I can tap people on the shoulder and I can ask them, hey, what about that PR? Like, how do you, it's like you're breathing down people's necks. Yeah. Like, how does that work out? Like, what do you recommend? Like, how do you message that? Right. Because I feel like that's always like the first awkward moment. It's like, hey, I know something that you were not aware of.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that definitely plays more into the sort of engineering metrics type of use case that, people have come to us for, where you're a manager or leader and you want to kind of keep tabs on what's going on in your org with your ICs. I think we are trying to be somewhat, we're trying to take the stand. We don't do that internally, right? So we don't really use this
Patrick,
data.
maybe stop sharing your screen, then we can, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but there you go, when we can see you talking. Yeah. Okay.
No problem. So our approach right now has been to remain I don't know if I have a satisfying answer to this, but we remain pretty neutral in that regard. So like how you use the data right now is kind of up to you as a user of MergeStat. Like we have our own opinions and things that we want to encourage. So we try to, we do have people using us to measure engineering velocity and productivity through proxy metrics, through things like, PR time to merge and whatnot. I think one piece of advice that we say is try to tie the data that you're seeing out of MergeStat or in a dashboard or something like that to an action that you can take that is positive or constructive, right? So if a PR is taking a really long time to merge, use that as an indicator of, it's now go and figure out why, and maybe have let that trigger a conversation versus just thinking bad, right? Red, taking a long time to merge something is bad, but use it as the starting point.
So now that we know everything about MergeStat, the product and the problem it solves, I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about company building.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you're working with a few customers, let's call them users, right? Or
Sure.
How do you think about building this project and building the company about MergeStat? What's the plan?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the end goal is we'd like to become the data platform for engineering organizations. So we want to be able to support any question that you might have about your engineering org. You should be able to ask it through MergeStat or using MergeStat in some way. Right now, we're a pretty small team. We're trying to be very focused in the user engagements that we're pursuing to prove out value in use cases at larger orgs. So we work with some cool companies that have lots of repos and not very much visibility into these things. We are backed by two institutional VCs, and so we haven't announced our funding yet, but that's something kind of on the way. And yeah, right now we're focused on proving value at larger organizations. We found that tends to be where we resonate the most, as opposed to kind of smaller teams, smaller companies.
Makes a lot of sense. Patrick, if people want to reach out to you, what's the best way of getting in touch with you and working with MergeStat?
Sure. The best way is probably email, honestly, patrick@mergestat.com. We have some forms on our website as well for beta interest for people to fill out. We're on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Patrick DeVivo, one word. And we have a MergeStat Twitter as well that we read the DMs from. So
fantastic. Patrick, this was great. Thank you for the session. So this was MergeStat, SQL for the software development lifecycle. You can reach out to Patrick via email. You just shared it. I'm going to share it in the show notes as well. Patrick, thank you so much. This was super informative. And let's check in a few months again. I'm super excited about the progress you're making. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me.